Now, almost every single revenue team that I meet with uses some form of revenue intelligence today. And the simple truth is that it is not working. It's not. And how do I know that? Well, for almost a decade now, revenue intelligence providers have made a lot of promises. And that has led to millions and millions of dollars getting invested in solutions. And yet at the end of the day, what do we see? Revenue teams are found wanting. And that's because it turns out when revenue intelligence solutions were designed, they incorporated 3 critical points of failure in the design. They literally designed failure into the product. Failure point 1, they're almost always based on siloed data. And what that means is a revenue operations team has to start acting like data scientists to connect the dots from one data set to the next to try to get a holistic picture of what's actually going on. Failure point 2, they have lots of lovely charts and graphs, and I promise you they are gorgeous. And they demo really well. They do. The problem is they don't actually answer questions you have. They just tell you things about the data that they can see. And that means your team is forced to try to find context and meaning from something that isn't even answering a question that matters to you. And finally, third, they don't tie off to action. And we all know that in a revenue organization, insight without action is meaningless. So it should not surprise us that the failure of revenue intelligence manifested last year in a study that Gartner did. So this number brought to us by our friends at Gartner is the percentage of revenue leaders that believe their analytics drive meaningful performance outcomes. So let's let that sink in for a second. 3%. 3%. Now, my friends, I do not know what you call something that is worse than an F-, but I promise you it is that. That is horrible. So when I see a number like that, when our product teams see a number like that, we have questions. And so we go to the source, and that source is conversations with people just like you. And we've had hundreds of them. And they have all centered around the same failure point. So I'll share an example from one I had recently. I was speaking to a CRO. She had just made yet another investment in revenue intelligence after spending over 6 figures on a competitor's conversation intelligence product. And so I had a lot of questions about this because she'd spent a bunch of money and then switched to another provider. And I asked her, what led to that? How are you using this solution? How's it driving day-to-day outcomes for you? And I will never forget what she told me. The second I asked that question, she made a face, and it's the kind of face that my wife makes when I forget something important. It's the thing you do not want to see. And I love my wife, by the way. She looked at me, and she had this exasperated look on her face, and she said, I go into this thing, and it's telling me stuff like seller A pauses for 10 seconds after asking a question on a call. And seller B, they pause for 15 seconds. She said, what am I supposed to do with that? If you cannot tell me that one is better than the other, that is just noise. And what's worse, that causes confusion on my management team because we do not know if we should coach to that. Noise. Despite millions and millions of dollars invested, noise. And so that reminds me of a quote by famous management theorist Chris Argyris. He taught at both Harvard and Yale. We like to call that the double. And he said, knowledge upon which action cannot be taken is barely worth having. And I want you to take that home. Because the simple truth is that today you are drowning in charts, graphs, and data tables. But instead of lighting the way to success, they are leaving you in the dark. Because that is not what you want. And that is absolutely not what you need. What you need are insights. And I mean real insights. And if you take only one thing away from what I talk about today, I want you to take this. A real insight, not what you have been sold, a real insight does two things. Number one, it has to tell you what drives outcomes. And I mean things like meetings booked, deals progressed from stage to stage, why your deals close, why revenue renews. Those are outcomes. If it cannot tell you what drives an outcome, it is not an insight. And second, it has to tell you the specific action to take to deliver that outcome. If it cannot tell you which action to take to deliver the outcome, it is not an insight. And that is not what you have gotten.